Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this capacity building briefing for UNCCD parties. I'm Sarah Toomey, and I'm Donor Relation Officer and Business for Land Team Lead at the Global Mechanism. And I'm very pleased to do the opening remarks and welcome you today in this briefing session. So we'll wait just a few more seconds for everybody to connect, and we will start. Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for joining today's session, this capacity building briefing on corporate disclosures and science-based target setting for land. This session is co-hosted with two of our valued partners and members of the Business for Land expert group on corporate target setting and disclosure, the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, and the Science-Based Targets Network, SBTN. As you all know, too often, land degradation is viewed solely as an environmental challenge. And every year, it costs the global economy an estimated $900 billion, while approximately 40% of the world's land is already degraded. And those figures represent far more than environmental loss. It translates into declining food security, increasing water stress, weaker climate resiliency, threatened livelihoods, and reduced productivity for the land on which economies and societies depend. So businesses and financial institutions are increasingly exposed to land-related risk through disrupted value chains, declining agricultural yields, stranded assets, higher operating costs, and a growing social and environmental conflict. Land degradation is no longer a peripheral sustainability concern. It is increasingly recognized as a material business and financial risk. And land-dependent sectors, including agriculture, extractive, infrastructure, forestry, energy, and more, they shape the land use decisions across hundreds of millions of hectares worldwide. So governments cannot achieve land degradation neutrality at scale and at the speed required on their own. They need to work with the private sector, which is a central stakeholder, not only for the financing solutions, but also for the implementation, for the innovation, for the responsible land stewardship, and for the transformation of the production systems. At the same time, incentives remain misaligned. UNEP estimates that for every dollar invested in protecting nature, approximately $30 continue to flow towards activities that degrade land. Bridging this gap requires more than additional finance. It requires a market and policy environment that makes land-related impacts and dependencies visible, measurable, and comparable so governments, investors, and companies can make better informed decisions. This is where corporate disclosure and science-based target setting become so important for the UNCCD process. Corporate disclosure enables companies to identify, assess their land-related impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities in a structured and transparent way. They also provide investors, regulators, consumers, and other stakeholders with reliable information that support risk assessment and, over time, better capital allocation. Complementing this, the science-based targets provide companies with a robust methodologies for establishing credible, measurable, and time-bound goals that help address biodiversity loss and land degradation while strengthening long-term business resiliency. Ultimately, if we are serious about achieving land degradation neutrality, we must ensure that markets recognize the value of healthy land and that businesses have both the tools and incentives to become part of the solution. Recognizing this, the parties of the Convention have consistently strengthened UNCCD's mandate to engage the private sector. Most recently, at COP16 in Riyadh, parties adopted Decision 6 COP16, reaffirming the importance of mobilizing private sector action, investment, and finance for sustainable land management and drought resilience. By working together with GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, and SBTN, the Science-Based Targets Network, we are helping connect those objectives of the UNCCD with the world's leading corporate accountability framework. GRI provides the world's most widely used sustainability reporting standards used by companies representing a significant share of the global economy, and SBTN provides a scientific methodologies that enable companies to translate environmental ambitions into those measurable science-based land targets. Together, these frameworks promote transparency, accountability, and credible corporate action that is totally aligned with the UN core values. Today's briefing has therefore been organized to help parties become more familiar with the evolving landscape of corporate disclosure and target setting, to understand how these frameworks work in practice, and to explore what they can contribute to the implementation of the Convention. Thank you very much again for joining us. I hope you find today's presentation and discussion informative and useful. And now I let the floor to the moderator, Liv Angerer. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Sarah. I too want to express a warm welcome to everyone who is joining us today. My name is Liv Angerer. I am part of the UNCCD's Global Mechanisms team working on the Business for Land initiative. And I also have the pleasure to moderate today's session. Before I go ahead, I see that there is a live question from one of our participants. So, Talia, would you like to take the floor? Maybe that was a hand raised by mistake. So I'll go on. Do let us know if that question still remains. We bring to you today an agenda that aims to take you through the entire disclosure and target setting landscape to really give you the latest insights into how businesses are assessing and also responding to their land-related impacts. We'll first hear from the Global Reporting Initiative on the corporate sustainability reporting landscape. This will be followed by our colleagues from the Science-Based Targets Network talking about how science-based targets can be leveraged for land degradation neutrality. And we'll end with a fireside chat across our three partner organizations, as well as one of our close partners and companies, Olam Agri. During this fireside chat, we also want to invite any questions or reflections that you might have on the content of this webinar. So I ask you now to please hold on to all of your questions and reflections. Feel free to also write them down in the chat if you want to let go and just put them down there. We'll then come to those questions during this Q&A segment. With that, it is now my pleasure to hand over to the Global Reporting Initiative, who will introduce the current corporate reporting landscape and explain to you how disclosure frameworks are helping to drive sustainable land management. Camila and Elodie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Liv, and warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And as part of the session, Elodie and myself will introduce the corporate sustainability reporting landscape and explain why impacts-based disclosures matters to UNCCD mandates and how it relates to other disclosure approaches such as financial ones. So we will do a deep dive directly into this. Now, first, let us introduce ourselves, and we're here to answer your questions as well. So we would like to do this as practical as possible for you. So I'm Camila Corradi. I'm a GRI policy manager, and I lead engagements with multilateral institutions and the UN system. I'm joined by my colleague Elodie Shen, senior standards manager, and she is GRI's nature and biodiversity technical expert and lead. and she leads our work on nature-related reporting. And we work at the intersection of corporate practices, reporting standards, and public policy, both jurisdictional and international policy as well. And our objectives today is to give you practical foundation for engaging with the relevant UNCCD COP17 discussions. Now, if we look at the agenda at GRI today, we are here to talk about, first and foremost, what is GRI, what is sustainability reporting, so basically like fundamentals of corporate disclosures and what they're designed to achieve. And we will also look at what is materiality, implications for different materiality approaches, the relationship between impact and financial impacts, corporate impacts and financial risks. We will look at a very practical example from the private sector, and then we will also discuss both national or jurisdictional policy developments and international developments when it comes to policy disclosures. Now, first, let's have a look at what is GRI. For those that do not know us, GRI, we are an independent international organization, and we provide standards for transparency for companies to assess their impacts on people, the planet, and the economy. So we take an impacts lens approach. So this will be a common thread throughout today's briefing. And why we will discuss why the impact perspective is important for land degradation, because impacts occur before they translate or have financial effects for the companies. As we say, impacts can also be another way of referring to externalities. So the GR standards, we produce the GR standards, which, as Sarah was saying, which are the most widely used reporting standards, and then developed as a free public good, and they're freely available on GR's website, and they're translated to several languages as well. GRI is always a non-profit organization, and we have a diversified funding model through grants, services, and also a membership community, which support our independent approach to standard setting. And also we provide capacity building, both for companies, but also for policymakers as well. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to our expert on nature and biodiversity. Elodie, you have the floor.
Thank you, Camila. And yes, let's dive right in. We will start by looking at what is corporate sustainability reporting, target setting, and how they connect with each other and business management. So then looking first at the definition of this concept, you'll see that corporate disclosure is the structured reporting of a company's impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities, and how those are managed in a form that investors, regulators, communities, and other stakeholders can use. Target setting is about setting measurable time-bound goals to avoid and reduce negative impacts and support positive outcomes. And Craig from SBTN will tell you more about it in a minute. And these two are not separate exercises. Together, they create a cycle through which a company understands its impact, commits to change, acts, monitor, and accounts for progress. And companies report for several reasons that are all connected. So first of all, to improve their own decision, to identify risks and opportunities earlier, to build stakeholder trust, and also track performance over time. So, and for government, this process also create a more consistent evidence base on how business activities affect land, water, biodiversity, and people. And that process is a continuous process, right? A company will start by establishing a baseline across its operations and also the rest of its value chain. It will set targets, takes action, and disclose progress over time. And new information from that cycle will feed into the next assessment and will help refine future actions and show continuous improvement over time. And in that cycle, then GRI provides the disclosure and transparency layer, while SBTN provides the science-based target setting layer. And together, they connect evidence about impacts with credible commitments and implementation. Now, the main question we'd like to cover with you now is what information should a company report? And that is determined through materiality and the lens, the materiality perspective that the company will adopt in its reporting. So, put simply, materiality determines which information is important enough to disclose. And its application depends on the perspective or the lens taken. So first, there's the impact materiality, which asks how the organization affects the economy, the environment, and people, whether or not those impacts have already become financially material for the company. So this is the basis of the GRI standards. Looking at an example, beverage companies which withdraw a lot of water may undermine the resilience of the local farmers to manage drought, but that may not be reflected into a financial loss for the company. They may still be able to operate as usual and not be impacted by that loss of water. So those impacts on farmers will show in an impact reporting, for example. Then there's financial materiality, which asks how sustainability-related matters affect the company's financial prospects, and this is the basis of the ISSB standards. So in the example I just mentioned before, that example will not show in such a report, but another example could be, for example, declining soil quality, which leads to lower yields, higher operating costs, and viability or financial viability issue for an agricultural business. So that example will show in a reporting that adopts a financial materiality lens. And then the double materiality consider both perspectives and integrate them both. And this is the one for the approach that is used by the European Sustainability Reporting Standards as part of the European legislation. So these two perspectives are complementary. And they are also very important. For the UNCCD mandate, it's important to have both perspectives to understand the full, to have the full picture on land impact and how those impact our, land-related issues and how those are managed. And in particular, the impact lens is really important as it can reveal land degradation where prevention is still possible. And then you'll see after on the next slide, it's more an illustration of these two lenses and also how they connect with one another. They are not disjointed, right? And you can see that the impact materiality, we look at issues like pollution of freshwater ecosystems, land conversion in operational supply chain, but also harm to communities, workforce, and so on. While the financial materiality, we look at those issues in the other way around. So how can these affect the financial position of the companies? Like, could water scarcity disrupt our production? How could biodiversity regulation increase compliance costs, and so on? So again, those are complementary, interconnected. And now to illustrate that connection, we look at the pathway from impacts to financial risks. And if you look, starting with how we define impacts and material topic in the GRI standards, so the impact is the effect that the organization has or could have on the economy, environment, and people, including their human rights. And the material topic is the topic representing the organization's most significant impacts. So not all of them, those that are the most significant, and those are the topics that will feature in the company's reporting. So now let's look at how those impacts may become financially material. And basically the central message is that impact is often the early warning sign, while the financial risk is the later manifestation. And significant impacts can trigger regulation, litigation, restrictions, and community opposition, for example, all could lead to loss of market access or tighter credit conditions. On the other hand, they may also reveal opportunities for companies to improve resource efficiency or develop more resilient practices in response to those impacts and those risks. But again, identifying the impacts first allows action before those financial consequences fully materialize. And how does this play out in financial decision making? So again, impact disclosures provide that first layer of information. They show where a company may be creating or reducing harm across its operations and value chain. Investors, lenders, insurers can use these signals to assess a company's exposure, vulnerability, and management quality. And that assessment can influence credit conditions, insurance pricing, capital allocation. And that is especially important when we look at long-term decisions, such as infrastructure finance, corporate lending, insurance. And again, without that impact information first, financial institutions may be working with an incomplete risk picture. So here we look at a very concrete example, considering an IT companies which operate data centers. And you can see that this company, through its water withdrawal and wastewater, may affect local water availability, ecosystem, communities, particularly if they are in a water-stressed area. So that would constitute impact. At the same time, that company depends on reliable water supplies for cooling the data center and for overall operational continuity. So that's a dependency. And over time, these dependencies and these impacts may translate into risks and opportunities. So, for example, if we look at risks, it can lead to restriction on water usage, on community oppositions, on higher operating costs, or even disruptions if water is no longer available. But the company may also find opportunities by developing alternative technologies, improving water reuse, or if they really look, at their potential impact before those impacts occur, they could also select more sustainable sites to avoid, for example, the most water-stressed areas. So again, that shows how drought cannot be, or land management at large cannot be assessed only as a physical risk, but how the full picture is important to be able to manage it sustainably. Now, I think I've mentioned already different standards, different organizations and acronyms. And for those that are not, familiar with the reporting and target setting space, that global landscape may look complex at first. But the truth is that we all play different but complementary roles, and we also work all together. And this slide aims to summarize that landscape. So first, at the global policy level, we have the SDGs and the three Rio Conventions that are really the key intergovernmental instruments which define the global sustainability agenda, objectives, international commitments. Then we have global disclosures and target setting frameworks, such as the TNFD, Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and the SBTN, which help organizations assess their nature-related issues and set targets. Then global disclosure standards define what companies report, to whom, on what materiality basis. And at global level, you have the GRI that focuses on impact reporting, while ISSB focusing on financially relevant information for the company. And these global standards more and more influence as well national and regional regulations. I mentioned the European regulations with the ESRSs, for example. And then we have platforms and benchmarks that collect, compare, or assess reported information. So again, these layers should be understood as complementary, and our work reflects these authoritative instruments and also are designed for interoperability with leading frameworks and standards. So now we would be looking at our standards a bit more closely and how, the role they play into that reporting architecture. And just to give you a very quick overview of how these standards are set up, they consist of a modular system of interconnected standards with three main components. So we have what we call the universal standards, which establish the reporting foundation, including disclosure on governance, due diligence approach, and the process for identifying those material topics. Then we have sector standards which identify impacts and topics likely to be material for companies within a particular industry. And then topic standards which provide detailed disclosures for different topics such as biodiversity, workforce-related topics, and so on. And together, these standards clarify what to measure and how to do it credibly and consistently. And these are examples of standards that relate to land-related issues. So with the brown cover are sector standards, and in particular, the GRI 13 and 14 cover the agriculture and mining sector standards. and they work together with our topic standards, so the one with the purple cover. And I've mentioned here as example our GRI 101, which is our biodiversity standard. We also have water standards on water and effluents, standards that covers air emission, local communities, rights of indigenous people, waste, all topics that are important for sustainable land management. And then very briefly, I also wanted to show here some example. I won't have time, I think, to cover them all in details, but it's really to show that a couple of years ago, we worked with companies within a pilot program, and we have case studies that we have published that shows how they report on biodiversity using our latest standard. And although the LDN principles were not one of the instruments that drive the development of this disclosure, we can see through the reporting a lot of evidence that shows how they already implement the 3 levels of the LDN response hierarchy. And so we have concrete examples of companies avoiding impacts through the environmental impact assessment, and that also shows in the reporting. Similarly, with companies that have identified the most significant impact on the supply chain to drive their action to minimize impact there, as well as examples of companies with no net loss commitments that have also piloted approaches to achieve these goals and also report on these very clearly in the report. So we can also share the link to this publication if it's of interest later, but for now, for the last section of our presentation, I'll hand over again to my colleague, Camila. Thank you.
Thank you, Lottie. And picking about where you were saying that materiality is a key concept that actually shapes what information is disclosed by companies, that gives way to 2 different materiality approaches: the impact and the financial one. So basically, the inward, inside-out perspective, which is the impact, so what impact companies are having externally, and the financial one on how sustainability challenges like land degradation affect the company's financial situation. So now, as part of the policy development section, we will have a look at what's the state of play of adoption, both voluntary and market adoption and policy adoption when it comes to impacts, risks, and opportunity disclosure policies. So if we have a look at the state of play of sustainability reporting, which is a research that GRI has done that was launched 3 weeks ago, data shows that GRI continues to be the most widely used sustainability reporting standard worldwide, which focuses on the impact perspective, which is referenced by 62% of global market capitalization, so companies representing 62% of global market capitalization and 40% of all large listed companies. So basically, GRI's reach is generally global, and there are companies headquartered in 107 jurisdictions that report with GRI, which is important because it shows that it's an effort, it's an investment that companies can do in different economic conditions. So for instance, currently 2 in 5 of all GRI reporters are now based in the global south, and Asia accounts for the largest share of GRI reporters worldwide. As you can see on the screen, also it shows data shows that sustainability reporting is a multi-framework, multi-standard practice. So in practice, companies are already combining the impact perspective represented by GRI with other frameworks standards, representing, for instance, the financial perspective, such as TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and for instance, the ISSB that my colleague Elodie mentioned, or the ESRS, the European standards as well, are combined all together. So this means that there is a de facto implementation of both the impact and financial materiality disclosures in practice. If we look at, well, I'm being mindful of time, but if we look at jurisdictions adopting the GRI, As you can see on the screen, this shows the share of market capitalization and the percentage of companies per jurisdictions, and you can have a look at the report with detailed data per jurisdiction. But basically, GR reporting rates are led by jurisdictions in Asia and Latin America, with the highest levels, including Taiwan, China, where GRI is mandatory, Argentina, Colombia, Singapore, Brazil, Malaysia. So this shows that it's also like a very common practice in global South countries and emerging markets as well. If we have a look at the market adoption, so what's the state of play of capital markets adoption? Well, if we have a look at the UN Stock Exchange Initiative, out of 74 stock exchanges with ESG disclosure guidance, 71 reference GI standards, meaning that 96% of the stock exchanges which are part of the initiative reference GRI, and this ESG guidance also reference other standard setters as well. But basically, this includes major markets such as Australia, Brazil, Canada, well, Germany, Hong Kong, India, Italy, Singapore. That listed companies are prompted to publish a GRI disclosure, a report including GRI. Now let's have a look at the jurisdictional policy development. So we looked at the voluntary market adoption. We looked at the capital, the stock exchanges adoption. Now let's have a look at the jurisdictional policy developments when it comes to disclosure policies, because there's a lot of developments in the past years that largely started with the European Union taking the lead and championing comprehensive disclosure policies. And to be more specific, I'm referring to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive of CSRD that actually requires double materiality, so requires both impacts and financial materiality reporting on an equal footing. And following this approach, there are many other jurisdictions now having adopted or taking steps to adopt comprehensive disclosure policies. For instance, China, under corporate sustainability disclosure standard system, require and following also the stock exchange's voluntary guidance, they adopt sustainability-related impacts, risks, and opportunities. And yes, also India, the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Report, BRSR, which requires the top 1,000 listed companies by market capitalization in the country to disclose impact information, drawing on GRI alongside some financial disclosures as well. South Africa, following the very long-standing and very mature corporate governance, the King Code frameworks, one of the most mature corporate governance frameworks, they're now in the process of adopting and defining their national approach and considering comprehensive disclosures, so at least considering impacts and financial materiality as well. And we see other countries like Egypt or Taiwan where GRI is mandated. So basically we see that, and looking at the next slide, actually, as jurisdiction adopting comprehensive disclosure, so impacts and financial materiality, or we consider double materiality disclosures, now make up roughly 40% of global GDP. And this is important for CCD because it puts the impact perspective on an equal footing as the financial one. So, okay, we looked at voluntary market adoption, stock exchanges adoption, national or jurisdictional adoption policies. Now let's have a look at the corporate disclosures in international policy. And we see also a lot of developments in the international and multilateral front, also in lines of the double materiality or impacts, risks, and opportunities. So, for instance, the CBD Cunning Montreal Target 15 that was adopted in 2022. The parties took a landmark decision, actually, calling on the parties to take legislative, administrative, or policy measures to encourage businesses to assess and disclose risks, impacts, and dependencies on biodiversity. But actually, this is not the first precedent. We can go back to the SDGs, to SDG 12.6 specifically, that actually calls member states to encourage sustainability reporting, actually to embed sustainability information in corporate reporting specifically. Very recently, in July, a year ago, in Sevilla, at the 4th International Conference on Finance for Development, member state adopted by consensus the Compromiso de Sevilla, or Sevilla Commitment, where they define private sector responsible business and sustainable finance measure or framework. And within that framework, sustainable finance framework recognizes sustainability disclosures, specifically on impacts, risks, and opportunities, also commonly known as IROs, now entering the jargon of corporate reporting, based on GRI and ISSB as the global standard setters that actually can ensure cross-comparability across different jurisdictional policy developments. And if we look at science-based targets under the UNFCCC and the science-based target initiatives, governments have endorsed science-based target setting for climate action under the science-based target initiative. And we will have Craig talking more about this. But to wrap up the international policy developments on corporate disclosures, let's have a look at the G20 position, and also next one coming after the UNCCD COP, the Global Framework of Chemicals. So the G20, specifically the Sustainable Finance Working Group under the South Africa Chair presidency in 2025, they recommended the G20 to improve data by encouraging robust decision relevant information on and based on international standards such as GRI and ISSB that can support cross-global comparability and interoperability to avoid fragmentation, which is to comply with different disclosure policies and national mandates. The G20 at the end of 2025 actually noted the recommendation from the Sustainable Finance Working Group and acknowledges the Sustainable Finance roadmap that actually encourages impacts, risks, and opportunities. Now, the global framework on chemicals, they're in the parties and in the process for defining the implementation, actually mechanisms to track progress on the framework. And what's being considered is actually the number of companies reporting on dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities, and on human health and the environment. And also another indicator being considered that is subject to decision in November 2026 is the number of financial institutions that include chemicals and waste in risk assessment, decision-making, policies, practices, or disclosures. And I'm being mindful of time, but we can discuss further. But last week, the second Global Nature Positive Summit in Japan, very broad coalition, including GRI and the GSSP, which is a standard setting body at GRI. It calls for standardized, science-based, and decision-useful metrics to measure corporate impacts and dependencies on nature. And it actually endorses the mitigation hierarchy to first avoid and minimize negative ecosystem impacts, and then contribute to a restoration and regeneration of landscapes and seascapes. So actually, it corresponds with the Land Degradation Neutrality response hierarchy. So this is momentum on the private sector. So on the for private sector, it's a private initiative, related to disclosures and target setting that the parties can leverage this momentum. So to wrap up, that's all these means for the UNCCD COP17. Well, what message we wanted to convey was that actually corporate disclosures and target setting is part of the accountability mechanisms for land. There's already a very widely established market practice across different economic conditions. There are already several policy, national jurisdictional policy developments in place, and a lot of developments at the multilateral international front as well. So actually, and taking into account the intention to create synergies across the Rio conventions, a very practical takeaway would be to borrow or mirror the language from Target 15 from the CBD, the biodiversity, and as a parties to actually adopt legislative, administrative, or policy measures. This is from Target 15 at the CBD that encourages companies to take transparency and accountability measures for land degradation and drought resilience. I will leave it there in my phone. I'm looking forward to the fireside chat to address any questions participants may have.
Many thanks, Camila and Elodie, for this excellent overview over the reporting landscape, how disclosure and target setting interact, and why both financial and impact materiality are critical for the mandate of the UNCCD. After having heard about how companies can share transparent information about their impacts and dependencies in the present, we are now turning towards future-oriented action. How can companies set credible goals for phasing out degrading practices and for phasing in conservation and restoration? My colleague Craig from the Science Based Targets Network has an answer. Craig, please take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Liv. My name is Craig from the World Wildlife Fund, and I represent the Science Based Targets Network's Land Hub as one of its co-leads. The Science Based Targets Network is a coalition of more than 80 NGOs, science-based organizations, and corporate partners that are looking to understand how voluntary corporate target setting in the corporate sector around nature can move companies towards global nature goals. So I'll start here by talking about what science-based targets actually are. Science-based targets take a shared global goal under the Rio Conventions, CCD, CBD, and UNFCCC, as well as the SDGs, and it turns them into specific time-bound commitments that a company can set, act on, and be held accountable for. The level of ambition is set by what nature needs, not necessarily what is convenient for companies, although there is some convenient overlap between those two things. Elodie and Camilla mentioned SBTI, our sister initiative on climate, where more than 13,000 companies, which is around 40% of global market capitalization, already engage validated science-based climate targets or commitments under SBTI. SBTN now brings that same discipline to nature targets, targets that are measurable, time-bound, and independently validated before they can be claimed by companies. For this audience, the key word is validated. There's an important check before a company can make a claim, and it ensures, through third-party validation, that companies making claims have had those claims vetted and understood by the accountability accelerator before they become official claims under SBTN. Next slide. So science-based targets for climate have existed for more than a decade, and most companies have engaged with them, and many have set them, like I said, over 13,000 companies. Nature has lagged in this space, and not because it matters less, but because it's harder to measure. SBTN is an initiative that seeks to close that gap. It translates things like the UN Convention to Combat Desertification and LDN targets, as well as the Global Biodiversity Framework and SDGs, into corporate level targets that are scientifically robust and validatable. In SBTN, we cover 4 main issue areas: land, freshwater, oceans, and biodiversity. And these are based on 5 steps that define a company's journey through assessment and prioritization to target setting, acting on those targets, and tracking and measuring. Steps 1 to 3 are live and in use today, and I'll explain what those are for land. And so companies are available to start now setting science-based targets for nature. The main point is that SBTN tells a company with scientific backing exactly where they need to act, how much is enough, and when to take the actions to reverse nature loss by 2030. Its methodologies are resources to guide the implementation of those targets. Next slide. So the SBTN process begins with the materiality assessment that asks companies to map impacts and dependencies across the value chain to the main global drivers of nature loss as they relate to land in our case, and similarly for freshwater and oceans. These include land use or land use change, pollution, direct exploitation, invasive alien species, and climate change. Companies assess their impacts, form their target boundaries, and then use state of nature variables to understand and rank where to act first. The third step on setting targets provides guidance and methods for companies to measure, set, and disclose their science-based targets. Next slide. So Elodie already mentioned this slide, but it bears repeating. Disclosure frameworks look at a company and nature through 2 specific lenses. Financial materiality asks how nature affects a company. Land degradation as a business risk, distributed supply chains, stranded assets, and rising costs. That's the outward in view. Impact materiality asks the opposite: how a company affects nature, its conversion of natural ecosystems, its effect on soil carbon sequestration, soil erosion, or terrestrial acidification. And this is the inward out view, and it's what Land Degradation Neutrality tracks and what we align SBTN with when we're talking about aligning with LDN. So far, in UNCCD, impact materiality is an essential lens. Only by disclosing their impacts on land can companies show a measurable contribution to LDN, and a framework that reports only financial risks really doesn't give you that. Next slide. So the SBTN is the leading framework for voluntary corporate nature action. It provides rigorous methods. It provides the tools to assess impacts and apply targets, and it's a model for public policy. In the target setting component, SBTN is rigorous, understood as the gold standard for science-based target setting, and covers the 3 major biome realms of land, freshwater, and ocean. It's built on the planetary boundaries concept and integrates work from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services to understand how companies are driving nature loss. As I mentioned, SBTN has independently validated targets. Second, SBTN provides capacity development on data, tools, and training around how companies and countries can interact with land targets. In support of companies setting our no conversion of natural ecosystems target, SBTN, WWF, and World Resources Institute work together to develop the SBTN Natural Lands Map, which divides the world into natural and non-natural land to allow companies to set a no conversion target baselined in the year 2020. SBTN also includes a materiality screening tool. So during the assessment phase, companies can understand for which pressures their operations and sourcing of conversion driving commodities are material. And finally, SBTN provides a corporate manual for the interpretation of SBTN guidance and many learning resources that help companies move through the process of assessing, setting targets. As a policy line, we can go. So until now, 55 companies have entered pilots with SBTN, 10 have publicly validated targets, and 27 more are in the validation process. Names like Caring are most relevant for this room. Wholesome, Global Building Materials with public validated freshwater targets, and several other companies that I'll talk about in just a minute. We've interviewed the leadership of these companies, and these companies have flagged 3 strategic values. SBTN focuses on action where nature actually matters for the company and for nature itself. SBTN connects scattered initiatives into one credible system that companies can use. And SBTN supports claims that are rooted in science and companies can be effectively held against. For Wholesome, they say that SBTN is not a target set with your finger in the air. The methodology is robust, logical, and prescriptive. And we've spent a great deal of time demonstrating and generating science behind how companies can translate their actions and interests into science-based targets that support the global goals for nature. Next. So in September this year, SBTN Land will launch the newest version of SBTN Land targets. For many of the targets, there are not many changes. Target 1 is no conversion of natural ecosystems, which directs companies to avoid the conversion of natural ecosystems. In this target, they deploy the SBTN Natural Lands Map to assess natural and non-natural land within their operations and sourcing areas, and then commit to eliminating the conversion of natural land within those operations or sourcing regions and production units. In addition to this pathway is what we call the MICE pathway, which stands for mining, infrastructure, construction, and extractive sectors. Due to the long timelines and investments of companies that represent these sectors, we've developed an additional pathway with different clarifications around how they interact with no conversion of natural ecosystems on a different timescale. The most substantial updates came to our second target, which is now the Working Land Regeneration and Restoration target. In terms of countries, this will be the most interesting target for engaging with new data and new ways of understanding degradation, as well as how companies can implement production practice changes in support of land degradation neutrality. This includes both land area targets on land footprint reduction and percent natural land cover, as well as land quality targets on soil organic carbon, soil erosion, and terrestrial acidification. All of these are underpinned by new accounting guidelines for impacts on land use and the environment, which allow companies a process to account for their impacts against these indicators and then develop targets and production practice changes that are ecoregionally specific, commodity specific, and place-based. Finally, our third target on landscape engagement asks companies to engage in a materially relevant landscape scale initiative with other stakeholders to deliver outcomes that improve ecological and social conditions. This target essentially asks companies to look through their operations and sourcing regions and to understand the places from which they source conversion-driving commodities and to engage in those places to improve ecological and social conditions. This target directly aligns with most work undertaken under land degradation neutrality, though it's not formalized yet. Next slide. So SBTN land and land degradation neutrality targets share a lot of indicators. They share a underpinning logic, and the corporate actions that companies take as their commitments to SBTN have direct impacts on land degradation neutrality. They pursue the same outcomes through the same land system logic. We ask companies to avoid the conversion of natural ecosystems, which addresses the primary driver of degradation and the leading cause of nature loss terrestrially. We ask companies to reduce and regenerate, looking at commodity-specific practice changes that keep production within safe operating spaces and restore working land. And we generate ecoregional thresholds for specific land indicators. And we engage companies in landscape scale, multi-stakeholder actions to improve ecological and social conditions. And when companies go to set their landscape engagement target, they have many places around the world from which they source commodities that they can choose to engage, and many partners that they can choose to work with, including NGOs and multi-stakeholder initiatives that they can engage with. The shared land quality indicators that are included are natural ecosystem conversion, soil organic carbon, soil erosion, and terrestrial acidification. We provide companies with specific targets around their contributions to these indicators through the commodities they produce or the commodities that they source. Next. Key to this was the development of ecoregional thresholds, or defining what nature needs and how much is enough. Unlike climate targets, nature targets have to be specific to the land that's involved. The version that we'll release in September, and that has been piloted with companies already, introduces place-based thresholds across more than 600 ecoregions for the land quality indicators on the right. A threshold marks the point at which an ecoregion risks a significant loss of stability and normal function if it's exceeded. Companies set the level of ambition and then direct restoration and regenerative action to maintain or enhance land quality in support of that ecoregional stability. These are grounded in the science of the Earth Commission's safe and just system boundaries, but they've been built from the bottom up to give more spatially explicit ecoregional level thresholds that can be contextualized within countries and within companies' operations and value chains. SBTN guidance now includes hundreds of data sets on land quality thresholds and thousands of land environmental assessment factors that quantify commodity-specific practice changes within these land quality categories. Next slide. The opportunity here is to connect corporate targets to national LDN targets. We recognize that the private sector action is evidence of progress, and we'd like to, through UNCCD's Business for Land program, begin to connect the corporate actions that companies take in landscapes in support of their science-based targets for land with country-level land degradation neutrality targets. These targets classify how corporate SBTN targets and the actions to achieve them materially support LDN target setting and implementation. We'd like SBTN targets to help develop guidance so countries can recognize corporate contributions to SBTN land targets as contributions to their national LDN targets. And then we'd like to support public-private partnerships on target setting and land degradation neutrality to catalyze investment, improve data flows, and accelerate progress, both for companies on their science-based targets for land, as well as countries on their land degradation neutrality targets. SBTN's first version of land targets already outlines how corporate targets are relevant to UNCCD, but what is missing is the operational guidance for countries to recognize and report private sector progress against their LDN targets. In order to build this bridge, we first have to analyze how companies' SBTN land targets align and contribute to national LDN targets. As these are developed nationally, each country provides a different perspective on how they tackle land degradation neutrality, and each company operating in a country has different ways of understanding and aligning with those land degradation neutrality targets. The joint document that will be shared at COP17's Business for Land Forum assesses the alignment in specific overlapping countries, and I'll talk about that in just a second. What we'd like to do is to co-develop guidance for countries to catalog and report corporate actions as evidence of LDN progress within the UNCCD framework. And finally, we'd like to mobilize mechanisms and policy to stimulate corporate investment in LDN supportive action and to strengthen the enabling conditions around incentivizing companies to set SBTN targets and report against LDN commitments. So SBTN sits within an established public-private architecture for land. Like I mentioned, UNCCD's Business for Land program names SBTN as a key corporate mechanism to help deliver global land goals. And SBTN connects directly to two of the three Business for Land pillars: business operations and value chains, and advocacy for enabling policy. Here we share an accountability architecture around public convening. UNCCD sets LDN goals and the national reporting frameworks under Target Setting Program 2.0. We share common methods. SBTN provides rigorous, validated corporate target setting methods for the private sector that align in most places with LDN targets. And we have capacity and economics behind the business case and delivery capacity that speak to the private sector in terms of how science-based targets for nature benefit their business and the business case for setting science-based targets for nature. Like I mentioned, at COP in Mongolia in less than a month, we will present 4 case studies that demonstrate country progress on LDN through corporate SBTN targets. And I can tell you that there is significant opportunity and overlap between the work that companies are doing in support of their landscape engagement initiatives, through their no conversion targets, and through their work in land regeneration and restoration, land footprint, or land area targets that support national progress on LDN targets. Companies in these cases are not affiliated with countries, but represent production or commodity sourcing locations for their SBTN targets. So they look across their entire value chain and understand landscapes that they can invest in that are material to them, and then work with other stakeholders in those landscapes to build ecological and social improvement. So what this means for COP17: corporate target setting as part of the accountability architecture for land. The 3 things as a delegate that you can carry into the private sector negotiations are SBTN as a ready mechanism. It provides companies with a credible, validated way to act on land. It's already in use, and it is mapped to the same indicators as land degradation neutrality. Secondly, SBTN is a bridge to national goals for companies. Spatially explicit corporate data can be recognized as evidence of progress towards national LDN targets, especially those under the second target setting program. And then finally, delegates can send a policy signal that enables disclosure and target setting for land that would mirror CBD's Target 15, positioning UNCCD in the international corporate accountability architecture. Science-based targets are a practical answer that's already on the table for countries to utilize in supporting their land degradation neutrality commitments. And with that, I'd like to conclude and move on to questions and discussions. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Craig. GI's presentation has demonstrated that corporate disclosure is a structured way for a company to identify and report its impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities in a form that the company itself, as well as investors, regulators, and other stakeholders, can use to inform decision-making. What Craig has now shared is that target setting is the practice of setting robust, science-based, and measurable goals to avoid and reduce negative impacts and increase positive ones. The two really go together in a mutually reinforcing cycle. A company establishes a baseline, sets targets, takes actions, and then discloses progress. I think another thing that these two presentations have highlighted very well is that there's already striking alignment between GRI standards, the SBTN methodology, and the UNCCD mandates. However, there are also still some open questions, such as how the information disclosed by companies can be better made available so that they become decision useful for governments, and how corporate land targets and actions could be leveraged for stronger public-private collaboration on land degradation neutrality initiatives. These are some of the questions and topics that we're looking forward to explore at COP, at some of the events that Craig has already pointed out, and that we also want to briefly touch on during this fireside chat now. We have reached the Q&A section of this webinar. So if you have any questions or reflections in response to what our two presenters have shared today, please feel free to put them in the chat or likewise raise your hand. Our IT support team will then unmute you and give you the floor. We'd also be very keen to hear, as a first starting point, whether you feel that today's webinar has already helped you to clarify the disclosure and target setting landscape. Please feel free to leave us a message on that in the chat also. We will move now on to a fireside chat between GRI, SBTN, UNCCD, as well as a company that's joining us today, Olam Agri. Again, we warmly invite you to come in at any point for questions or reflections. Just raise your hand and we'll give you the floor. I'll just stop sharing for now so that all of the participants can be readily seen on the screen. And Julie, actually, I would actually like to start with you. You are the one person that we haven't heard from yet. So I'd love to give you the floor so you can introduce yourself as well as Olam Agri.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Julie Green. I'm heading up the sustainability team at Olam Agri. Olam Agri is based in Singapore. We are a global food, feed, and fiber agribusiness. We're actually operating directly with a physical presence in more than 30 countries, and we're sourcing from many, many more. We have over 70 processing and manufacturing facilities, and our value chains are spanning grains and oil seeds, rice, cotton, edible oils, wood products, rubber, and many more. We source from small farmers and large farmers and companies alike, and we process the products as well. And so this breadth of origins, of supply chains, of geographies where we're operating means that in practice, land, soil, water, and biodiversity, they're not just a peripheral concern for us. They are structural to the business. They really underpin the success of our business as a global agribusiness. So the questions that we're looking at in this webinar around disclosures and how these frameworks that we've just heard about can help us to assess and to monitor, manage, and select actions is really something that means a lot to us, and we're happy to be here to get to share a bit about our journey.
Many thanks, Julie, for this very practical example of how materiality, impact, and financial materiality actually relate to a company. I also want to point out that Olam Agri is actually one of our Business for Land champions, and we have been very grateful for the collaboration up until now. Olam Agri has also long invested in sustainability disclosures. And I was therefore wondering if you could share an example of how the information that you're generating through these processes has actually influenced a business decision or changed the way that you've managed land-related impacts in practice.
Thanks, absolutely. I would say the clearest example is, first of all, how we've used the GRI standards and GRI 13 for agriculture in particular. And also recently the TNFD frameworks as well, and similar. So we've used these as a structuring and a discipline setting tool for us, rather than just for reporting. So when GRI 13 came out, for example, we mapped its recommendations against its disclosure requirements against our existing policies, our existing data systems, And by doing that, it helped to surface gaps. So some topics or some data points that we weren't yet capturing systematically. So this helped us to identify aspects to add to our policies and to our data collection. It expanded the breadth of what we monitor. For example, while we were already starting to look at and map forest loss risks and some land degradation risks across our supply chains, we weren't necessarily doing that next to our processing facilities. We felt that, we already were living our processing facilities all the time. But because of the GRIs, we started looking at actually how each of our facilities mapped to natural protected areas, as well as to indicators like the IBAT biodiversity indicators.
Yeah, really interesting to hear how using GRI standards can help a company surface gaps and provide structure on how to gather and process information. Ola Magri captures impacts on land as well as the financial risks that land biodiversity degradation poses to your business. How does each of these lenses, both the impact and the financial materiality lens, inform the way that you manage land? And why do you think that both are needed?
Oh, absolutely. We look at land through both lenses. We look at all of our environmental risks and opportunities through both lenses. It's incredibly important to us to think about how resilient our own supply chains are. And so we have to look at how do we impact the supply chains ourselves, whether directly or indirectly, because of what we choose to source or invest in, or where we choose to set up infrastructure, and how that might affect the operations and the farming, for example, that grows and thrives in a certain area. So we have to think about what impacts our physical infrastructures and the supply chains that they touch have on the environment, on the natural ecosystems, on the water use, for example, and on people who are then possibly affected by that water use. At the same time, we have to look at it from the other point of view as well. And so how for example, a less resilient supply chain because of ecosystem concerns, because of climate change. Of course, we also look at human aspects as well, just to complete that a bit, though we're talking about nature here. So if the agri systems are not resilient, that also has an impact on our business. And that's a big part of what we do in sustainability, is making sure that as a company, we're looking not only at the short-term impacts, but at the longer-term impacts both ways.
Really striking to hear how these corporate disclosure practices are for you not just a tool that aims at external communication, but also really as an internal resource that helps you preserve the resilience and longevity of your business model. I'd like to now turn to my colleagues at GRI and SBTN, reflecting a bit on that both corporate disclosure and target setting have been successfully employed as a lever for positive corporate action in the climate and nature spaces. And in order to perhaps refer some lessons for UNCCD, what, in your opinion, have been the most impactful actions by policymakers to accomplish this for the climate and nature spaces? Maybe first giving the floor to GRI.
Yes, I'm happy to take that one. Yes, I think the single most impactful action that policymakers have taken is really to move disclosure and I guess target setting as well from a voluntary behavior, voluntary leadership behavior by companies to an expected baseline for responsible business conduct. And then make sure that they set those expectations with, regulation, common standards, and also market consequences and incentives. So, we mentioned target 15 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which set this kind of expectations. So that's the kind of, I guess, that can lead to the kind of action that we see from policymakers. And some, I guess, let's say, for example, of actions that can facilitate this is, first of all, that policymakers mandate the disclosure of impacts alongside financial risks. And we see that Camila mentioned examples of regulators that require companies to report on both their impacts and the risks, like the EU, South Africa, China, and others. Again, reiterating that when we talk about soil degradation, water depletion, harms to ecosystems and communities, the impact lens is not optional. It's also very important as they help identify those issues before they register as financial risk to the company. I guess another point is also to make sure that those requirements are aligned or anchored with to internationally recognized standards and leverage what exists, right? In terms of reporting standards, we have GRI looking at impacts and ISSB for financial materialities, SBTN for target. We also, Julie mentioned the TNFD, which is also that leading framework for integrated assessment of your nature-related issues. So that's also, I guess, very important. And there are examples like the EU or the Indian regulations build on the GRI standards. So they are precedents to that. And again, create real demand for the information, right? The disclosure needs to lead to, consequence and changes to behavior. So, example will be, use public procurement, access to finance, development of private finance or market access as incentives as well. And maybe one, we haven't mentioned, but for the upcoming COP, we're developing a couple of case studies, one with Olam and one interesting, discussions we had in developing these case studies was one of the highlights was how this, let's say, global or common expectation that standards and frameworks set, for example, what has happened around deforestation and conversion-free supply chain. Sorry, it's always a tricky one to say. I've helped as well company to adopt more consistent definitions, traceability system, and overall approaches to these issues. So again, take that into account. And just one last point very quickly is also capacity building. So we need to prepare expectation with capacity and data. Companies should be able to meet any requirement or mandate set by jurisdictions, especially when we look at smaller firms or companies in developing economies.
Many thanks, Elodie. And picking up on the question that we've received in the Q&A panel from our representative from the Dominican Republic, many developing countries still have limited experience with corporate sustainability reporting. What, in GRI's views, are practical first steps that you can recommend to governments that want to encourage companies to start reporting on land-related impacts?
Yeah, so I think we, or Camila, go ahead, maybe.
Mute, sorry. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I'm happy to take that one over because it's a great question. And I would say that two main points. The first one would be that as a refresher, that the central premise to impact reporting is that it serves multiple stakeholders. So not only investors as the financial materiality perspective, but also to governments and regulators among the primary users of impact-related information. And what's very important for the national focal point is to distinguish among like very concrete uses for this impact data. What is the policy objective? What is the Dominican Republic or the national focal point trying to achieve? And it boils down to the national priorities. So I'm happy to provide several examples of how jurisdictions have approaches or the policy rationale for either mandating, so the sticks, so a compliance-based approach, or recommending, incentivizing, or actually putting in place incentive systems for companies, so the carrots and the sticks, right? So to start with, for instance, a very concrete policy reason is that it advances national goals and policy priorities, and this is very concrete in, so it ties to broader, so corporate disclosures tie to broader objectives. Could be resilience, could be sustainable growth, sustainable finance, I think that already mentioned, and or capital markets development. So China, for instance, they frame disclosures as a way to implement its development philosophy, as a way to foster harmony between humanity and nature. Oman, for instance, they tie it to the national vision towards 2040. The other jurisdictions, it's a matter of supervision and regulatory oversight as well. So, for instance, the Central Bank of Egypt, they require banks, so the banking sector in Egypt, to issue a GR report, because for them it's important, it's a monitoring system towards their sustainable finance agenda and to monitor climate risks across the sector. For others, it's public accounting and portfolio oversight, and this is very clear in Sweden, for instance. They used to, before the CSRD, the European directive, corporate reporting directive, they used to mandate GR reported for state-owned enterprises as a way to preserve the resilience of state-owned companies, so the state-owned business sector in the country as a priority, but also as a reporting mechanisms for accountability to the parliament. So how the SOEs, so state-owned enterprises, are contributing to impacts on the environment, people, and the economy. The other one could be like procurement decisions or access to finance. So, for instance, in Indonesia, sustainability reports are increasingly used for supervisory and funding decisions. So, actually, sustainability performance can be attached to access to green finance or certain incentives, like in the case of Chile, that there are tax procurement incentives based on credible and verifiable, there's a label reporting. For others, in the case of Australia, it's a matter of a specific topic. So tax transparency is an important topic for Australia. So in Australia, they have a public country-by-country tax reporting that actually draws on GRI 207, the standards on tax transparency. And for Australia, it's a way to report into their OECD tax transparency agenda. And a very important one, it's actually about capturing externalities that, from the financial perspective, may miss. Because impact reporting starts from an impact materiality assessment, so it surfaces the impacts that companies are having on the local communities or the water or biodiversity areas in a specific location. So it's an accountability mechanisms for companies on, surfacing those externalities and, prompting companies to act. And Brazil, for instance, they treat impact assessment as key to identifying the risks, financial risks, and actually setting a strategy to take action upon those externalities. And another reason could be that I think it kind of hinted in the conversation. It's about global value chains and access to trade and ensuring that the data produced by local, like domestic companies in the country are globally comparable. And for these, global standards are very important because that ensures a global comparability. And so basically it's a way from the government to prompt companies to produce data that is requested by business partners in another market. So it's about getting access to markets. I'm thinking about, for instance, the EU-Mercosur trade deal, for instance. There are certain environmental provisions. Well, how to foster that data provision to business partners in other markets in a comparable way. So it's about finding out in a nutshell where are the policy rationale behind it and how corporate disclosures can support national policies.
Many thanks, Camila, especially for all these detailed examples. I think that goes a long way in really illustrating your point here. Craig, I'd like to address the second question from our Dominican representative to you. Here, the question is that looking ahead to COP17, what are the concrete actions that you would recommend to national focal points to take if they want to engage the private sector in contributing to national LDN targets by setting science-based targets?
Yes, this is an excellent question, and thanks for the time today to answer it. I mean, we began developing SBTN's methodological framework in 2020 and deliberately recognized the importance of including and aligning with UNCCD's indicator framework as we're developing our SBTN land targets. So concrete actions that companies or countries can take. We can look to the policy landscape. I think Liv's first question was on, levers for positive corporate action. We find that the rollout of different regulatory frameworks, like Elodie mentioned, does have an impact on the interest of companies in exploring science-based target setting. But I think that there's a difference between interest in companies exploring and disclosing and the actions that they take. And we need to provide companies not only with the regulatory or incentive frameworks to set science-based targets, but we need to provide companies with the data and tools that allow them to make progress on those targets. And this is something I see a lot of times in policy. For example, the corporate sustainability reporting directives, ESRSs, sometimes go a little bit too far in asking companies to report on things that they don't have the data or availability to understand and report on. And so I think from a policy perspective, engaging the public sector in actions that they can take with data that's available is incredibly important. And I think that there is a difference between setting targets and having something concrete and science-based and time-bound, and the ambitions that we all carry with us in our work on these global sustainability goals. For national focal points, in terms of specific actions you can take, we're working on the case studies for COP, and I'm excited to share them with you in Mongolia. One of the things that jumps out from a national perspective is that every country has a different way of accumulating and reporting on progress for their LDN targets. And a lot of times this comes in terms of extension services from different ministries that work on different programs that ladder up local reporting to national reporting. And one of the things that we've developed in SBTN is a kind of middle ground reporting proxy that looks at practice changes that companies or landowners can implement and the impacts of those practice changes on land quality indicators. So it's a little bit between these nationally derived hectare reporting figures and the local soil organic carbon measurement. There's a middle ground there. And I feel like in countries working with landscape scale initiatives or extension services with the different ministries that work on your land degradation neutrality targets and connecting private sector corporate action around the sourcing or production of commodities, maybe not directly, but at least tangentially to those national programs, so that companies working on sustainability, working on regenerative agriculture, working on science-based targets for land can feed in to those local or regional level reporting systems that countries use to make progress on their LDN targets. I feel this is a very unexplored space, and there's really a lot of opportunity there. Thank you.
Many thanks, Craig, and something that we'll explore also in much more detail at our sessions at COP. Being a bit mindful of the time, I want to take us through the closing by letting you know that as a follow-up to this webinar, we will be sharing the presentation as well as resharing the pre-reader that our partners at SBTN and GRI have so kindly prepared, and that you can also re-reference to find any of the information that we shared. I also want to warmly invite you to join us at COP17 as we do a high-level showcase of the GRI and SBTN case studies at the Business for Land Forum on the 24th of August, that is Finance Day, as well as, if you're really interested to dive deeper into this topic, attend our Business for Land dialogue on corporate disclosures and target setting on the 25th of August, where we'll discuss in much more detail what the opportunities for stronger alignment are in the future, and prioritizing how we can advance this work to really capitalize on some of these opportunities that we touched on. It has been a pleasure to be here for me today. I'm really thankful to our partners for delivering this excellent presentation. And I would now like to hand over to Sarah for the closing remarks.
Yes, thank you very much, Liv. And thank you all. We are coming now to the close of today's webinar, at least this session. We still have another one on the afternoon if you still want to attend. I would like to extend, of course, my sincere appreciation to all our speakers and participants. In particular, to thank the Global Reporting Initiative, the Science Based Targets Network, and for sharing their expertise. And I can see the interest of some of our NFPs to actually get more trainings on this topic. So this will be discussed probably at the COP, and hopefully we can move forward on this after the COP. I would like also to thank Julie Green from Olam Agri for sharing her perspective as a business for land champion and representative of the Business Observers Group of the UNCCD. So today's presentation have helped us demystify a rapidly evolving landscape and have demonstrated the value of continued collaboration between the Convention and leading corporate accountability initiatives. I hope today's discussion has provided useful technical insights to prepare for COP17, and that it has strengthened your understanding of how corporate disclosure and science-based target setting can support the implementation of the Convention to achieve land degradation neutrality and drought resiliency. Maybe a few key messages that have emerged from this discussion today. So first, restoring land at the worldwide level cannot be achieved by government alone, and mobilizing the private sector with Business for Land via the partnership with a corporate target setting and disclosure framework can actually help accelerate this effort and also benefit the entire economies. So maybe a topic to follow up on at the COP and beyond. Secondly, corporate disclosure and science-based target setting are becoming increasingly important tools for translating ambitions into actions, not only for the private sector, but actually also for governments. They help improve transparency, accountability, comparability, while enabling companies to better understand and manage their impact dependencies, risks, and opportunities related to land. In doing so, they can help align private sector decision-making with national priorities for LDN and achieve the restoration of 1.5 billion hectares by 2030. So today's discussion has shown that there are significant opportunities to leverage existing corporate frameworks and accelerate positive business action on land. Parties will have the opportunity to strengthen the enabling environment for corporate disclosure and science-based target setting during discussions at COP, and we should just be also mindful that this discussion is going in parallel, also going on with the other Rio conventions, and actually it helps creating better alignment across our three conventions, creating greater coherency, not just across land, climate, biodiversity agendas, but also then, thanks to the Business for Land community and UNCCD parties, creating better coherency between public and private sector action. I will end here. Thanking you all once again for your active participation, staying here until the end of the session. And of course, the Business for Land Secretariat remains at your disposition if you have any questions following this webinar. Thank you very much and have a good day.